Okay, so let's get started. And Seemay, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to start with probably the question you get the most often, which is, what is Arcadia?
Okay. And much to Lauren's chagrin, I still have not come up with like a super succinct, splashy tagline for this.
Me too.
What is Arcadia? The reason it's hard to explain is because it's hard to pattern match it with institutes or companies, because I think at the core, what Arcadia is it is itself a meta science experiment. And what that means is that we're an organization that is literally experimenting with how we do science to see if we can think of new and better ways to support and, do the kind of science that we really want to do that would be best for, societal progress. And so there are elements that are borrowed from a lot of different organizations, both within academia and within biotech. And so it doesn't perfectly fit any of those, but really what we see as success probably is another way to define what Arcadia is about, which is we see the most important thing is that we learn something about how we do science. Whether that's successful in the for-profit space, in any other metrics that you might want to throw at it is like less important to us than the fact that we want this to be a place where there's high rate of learning on different ways to do science.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Perfect. So, when we think about like what we want to change in science, like what are we kind of reacting against, Prachee, I'm going to throw this to you. Like what are some of the elements, some of the outcomes of science that we're hoping to change?
Yeah. So when I sort of explain, how I think about our experiment that we're running and how we operate in science is thinking about it in sort of like three different ways. One is obviously the one that you can see from our website, changing what science we do, right? So really broadening the range of the tree of life that we use, letting evolution solve biological problems, doing science in this efficient way where if we just don't look at what is human and what's like humans, there's such a great diversity of ways in which biology operates that we don't have to run every single experiment when nature has run it for us, right? So thinking about what science we do and leveraging all of this, unique, information that we have. And so what science we do is one aspect of it. And another aspect is that, believing that this is a really efficient and important way to do science, even though we kind of know this, right? There are a lot of different examples between CRISPR and GFP and Taq polymerase, like all of these things that came from a broad range of science, right? We sort of know this, but when push comes to shove, that's not where we put a lot of our resources and our energy, right? So I think about, what science how we fund that science, how we get more of this science to happen everywhere, right? In all different sectors, whether it's in the public sector, private sector, how can we make an impact and change, how this kind of science gets funded so more of it can happen, right? And then the last piece of it, which I think is totally interconnected with all of the things that we're doing at Arcadia, is how science gets communicated, right? We believe that open science is better science. It's more rigorous. It's faster. That really it's a recognition that all good ideas don't live in this house. They live wherever they live. The expertise lives wherever it lives. And it's really important for us to say, if we really want our science to be better and convince everyone else that they are too closed with their science, that all of us can benefit, science and society can benefit and advance much more rapidly if we communicate our science openly. Really want to sort of plant the flag on the outside, change the way we think about doing this kind of research communication. So to summarize, I really think what science we do, how it's funded, how it gets communicated, these are things that are really at the forefront of this experiment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. True. Okay, so we have our first questions from the chat. So I'm going to pause my questions and ask a couple of these. So I'll shoot this one at Seemay first. Aditi asks, I apologize if I butcher your name. Does Arcadia liaison between academia and industry? Seemay, how would you put Arcadia kind of in that landscape?
So I guess I'm not totally sure what the verb liaison means in this context. But let me I'll assume you mean like, are we trying to bridge like interactions between academia and industry? And the answer simply would be no, that actually what we think of as ourselves is we are like an independently operating unit where we can be separated from both academia and biotech and some of the incentives in that space for a minute while we kind of figure out like how we reset and rebuild in a way that makes sense. It can be actually very difficult to conduct this experiment if you're still sort of bridging and have ties to systems that are structured fundamentally differently. So this is part of the reason why we have like made pretty hard lines about, not publishing in journals, not doing tenure, like different expectations from our investors in terms of like return on investment and timelines for that. Like all of those constraints need to be fundamentally different. And the more we try and liaison and bridge, actually, the harder it is to run like a pure experiment. And that's not to say that forever we won't be doing it. But I think for this beginning building phase, it's really critical that we're separate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And this that follows up with another question that was posed, which is, do we have labs or do we collaborate with universities for lab space? We have our own lab space in Berkeley. We will collaborate with academics, but we don't collaborate on the university level. We don't have any academic affiliations. So I'll toss this one to Prachee. Nicole wants to hear more about kind of the internal structure of Arcadia and how do different teams talk to each other. And what are the goals? That's kind of a big question.
Yeah, that's a really good and big and good question, right? So one of the things is in kind of to riff off of what Seemay was saying in thinking about how do we set up structures that sort of remove some of the barriers that we see, right? And so one of the things that we've been trying to avoid is like siloed different groups, right? Where we have these sort of like fiefdoms that are very top down, that are very sort of it feels like there's ownership over certain groups and things like that. And we have much more fluid structure in the sense that we have, I feel like one really great opportunity that we have is to have, individual contributors that are really empowered to pursue, their interests and also, the needs of what we think is going to be really impactful as, our role as Arcadia in the ecosystem, right? And so people are really freed up to contribute their science to the things where it's needed and where they're most advantageous, right? So I will give you like one example is that we've been trying to separate the ways in which we, I mentioned we're going to be putting out different kinds of research products. And one of the most impactful things we did early on was basically say that we're going to sort of get rid of like hierarchical author lists in the research products that we put out, right? And that means that we're not going to just have like first authors and last authors and, like try to set up some sort of structure that way that is like really where things belong to groups and it's set in, really rigid terms in that sense. So then there's no sort of competition. It's one of the, it had a dramatic impact internally where there's no competition where, this is my project and this is your project and I will get most credit for it. And you will get more, I don't want to work on that because I won't get as much credit for it. But now people are freed up to contribute to the types of science where that is really fitting for their expertise and their interests. And then the problem becomes, bandwidth and not credit. And that's a really nice problem to have, right? So I would say that the internal structure is a lot more fluid. We do have like designations that help us just try to think about how we make sure that, we don't have team sizes that are too big for certain projects because it's hard to, to effectively manage like large numbers of people all at once. So try to keep with like principles of efficient management, but also have it be a lot more fluid where we have, people working collaboratively, across the organization. Mm-hmm. I think I only answered like one of those questions, but
there's so many good questions. I feel like we can just go through them all.
Yeah, we're just gonna bang through the questions. I'll keep my questions in the hopper if we need them, if questions run out. But you guys are asking great questions, so we'll just roll with these. I love this question. So I love basic science and curiosity-driven science. I always wonder how your research on microorganisms is good for a common person. Seemay, do you want to why is studying microbes important for kind of, Joe Schmo, Joe Sixpack?
I mean, I think history would tell you that so many of the amazing innovations in the world come directly from microbes. I mean, they've been around way longer than us. So they've been evolving all sorts of mechanisms that we can borrow. I mean, CRISPR is the most recent example, right? But our bodies are coated and filled with microbes. It affects everybody. Your health in different ways, good and bad. I mean, I think there's evidence everywhere. And that there's lots of like opportunity for innovation there. So we've barely scratched the surface of microbes. If you think about how many microbes are on this planet, and like protists are one of the most abundant groups of organisms
Don't
on
even
the
get
planet.
started on protists.
Like we've barely gotten started, you know? And so I think this is the next revolution, is thinking beyond just a few organisms and really broadly about all the different ways we already engage with microbes and can repurpose some of those tools.
Absolutely. Prachee, do you want to follow up on anything there? I can just see
when she said microbes, you know, when you said she said protists, right? You know, yeah, obviously, like we all, optogenetics came from, you know, the green algae that I started studying. And, you know, there's a huge number of different innovations, right? Where we actually look at, you know, unique properties of these organisms, and also thinking about that in the context of, you know, living in communities, right? That's another thing that we're really doing here at Arcadia, is not thinking about them in isolation, but thinking about the ways in which, you know, organisms hijack each other's biology, right? And using that, right? Leveraging the innovative ways that they have of interacting with their environment and their own ecosystem to find ways where we might re-engineer solutions that would apply to humans, right? So I think there's a huge amount of potential there.
Yeah. I mean, you gotta mention Rachel and cheese. If you care about cheese, wine, bread, and, you know, any of these wonderful fermented foods, that's all communities of microbes doing that. So bless. Okay, so Claudio wants to know, how does research in Arcadia get funded? I'll pitch this to Seemay.
So yeah, this is something that we are actively evolving on, actually. The way we've been thinking about it is to think about like what were elements of the grant writing process that were good. There are good things, right? Like we're not trying to disrupt everything here. The good thing is like, you know, having a process where you can like simply convey what you're trying to achieve and the impact of it and what it would take. And then right now, because we're only about 20 people, it's a pretty like nimble, quick process of just like talking to me and Prachee about it right now. And we just like discuss it and we try it and think about milestones. I think the challenge is actually not that people are not getting enough resources. The challenge is that people are a little bit constrained in thinking about all the ways in which they could like have more resources, right? And thinking about like, this is not like an individual endeavor anymore, like a PhD. This is like truly a team collaboration. And our time is also the most valuable asset. That's the other thing. Like we probably spend more time pushing people on this, like stop trying to do this in the traditional kind of way of like your time is like this limitless resource. Like what if time is not? What if time is your most valuable asset? Like how can we throw more resources at things? So right now, actually the pendulum is in the other way of like, we're trying to really like push people to think bigger and put more resources towards it and speed it up. And so there is some evaluation process. The harder thing that we're sort of grappling with right now is like, when do we kill projects, right? It's actually quite easy to start stuff and fund stuff, but like, what is the goal and when do you call it? And like, those should be actually happy moments when you decide that something is not worth pursuing, not like a failure thing, but a pivot thing, as we like to say internally. And so that's where a lot of our thinking has been recently about in this process.
Mm-hmm. And then Stephanie has kind of a follow-up question to that, is how can this, or she asked about how exploratory science funded, and then how can it be self-sustaining? So how do we think about making Arcadia self-sustaining?
So that is kind of the translational component of it. And I saw a couple of other questions in there that are kind of related, if I could kind of try to tackle a bunch of things at once. So I'm going to just give a little background on who are the funders, what is the goal from that perspective, and sort of what's the general strategy. So the two funders are Jed McCaleb and Sam Altman. And I think the history of what they were trying to fund at the get-go is actually really important for this question, because Arcadia started out as a nonprofit institute concept. And so those two were willing to foot the bill for a $500 million project that was nonprofit, aimed at seeing how we could really accelerate and change the kind of science that we do. So that was like the ground sort of truth of like what this was about. It evolved into a for-profit, and that is why they have like extremely different views on return on investment than an LP that would come into a VC fund or something to fund a biotech company, right? And so there's actually it didn't start with the expectation of profit. And so now the goal is to think about how we can loosen up the tax structure and all the structures to really make sure we capture the value of some of the science we do, funnel it back in so that we can fund the actual science. So I think in that sense, like it really breaks like people's like mental map of like what an investor means. It's just think of it as totally different. So their expectations, like if they wanted to make money off of something, they would not have invested in this. This is not the point of Arcadia. Why are we doing it though, then like this? Because we do want to figure out how to make it financially sustainable. And we want to think about, ways that basically we can make it more possible for others to do this too. And so our general translational strategy is thinking about how we can incubate and spin out companies coming from Arcadia. And we would take a very different approach than university tech transfer offices typically do, where we want to fully assign the IP to companies. And we have this internal model for some folks of like up and out. We want entrepreneurial people and scientists to lead this, to found companies based on their work internally. And sometimes that means spinning out autonomously into their own company. And then the idea would be that Arcadia takes a percentage of that based on how much we incubate it for. And then everybody at Arcadia has shares in Arcadia, and by virtue has shares in the future profits of those companies. And so that's the overarching view of it. I don't know if Prachee, you wanted to comment more. Maybe there's some important stuff that I missed.
Yeah, no, and I guess I just want to highlight for people, just, because I get this question a lot too, is that what's expected of a scientist that comes into Arcadia, right? Like, is every scientist that comes into Arcadia, like, is that the way that they like come up with something that is like translatable and then go off and like spin out? So no, that's not necessarily the case. We just actually believe that there are different people who are good at different things, and that getting them under the same roof is really, really important, right? Like, there are sort of discovery scientists that are really, really good at, exploring a broad range of biology and thinking really innovatively about that. And sometimes those are people who think in terms of, what is possible today, not what could be possible if we innovated on, technology and tools. And so we have a sort of a technology, arm that is really thinking about, that are real innovators in pushing forward, what is possible to uncover, and not just with what exists today, but what could be possible, right? So getting those people under the same roof really helps everyone think differently about what science we can, innovate on. And then further, none of those people might necessarily be the right people. They could be, but may not be necessarily the right people to think about what is the best way to think about de-risking those things, landscaping what really else is out there, thinking about what the impact of that could be in commercialization. So having people who are more entrepreneurial that want to take a project at that stage and really try to, go from this sort of basic science to commercialization, like, at this early stage where we're incubating that, that is something where, those might be different people who we also want to get in-house that can help us identify what those interesting leads might be, right? And so there are a lot of different kind of scientists at Arcadia. It's sort of like, it is a whole ecosystem of scientific progress, right?
It's like an ecosystem for scientific progress.
I want to make one more comment on this for those in the audience that are like really interested in sort of this aspect of it. I mean, we think a lot on our science on like, what are the ways where Arcadia has a unique competitive edge? I think about this for our translation too. And one way we have a unique competitive edge is thinking about tooling, because a lot of the tools that we're going to be innovating, optimizing are themselves commercializable products, whether they're platforms or specific tools. And these are often fairly low risk in terms that like they can bring in revenue. The reason they're not that popular in the VC space often is that they don't always bring the ROI that LPs might want. In our case, because we're not optimizing for the highest possible profits, this opens up for us a huge portfolio that both helps our science and helps other scientists if we can commercialize and distribute it at scale and can keep our lights on. And so I think that is a tremendous advantage we have. That's like a great example of a win-win for both the science and the translation.
Yeah, and I just want to make one last, she just reminded me of another thing, which is that when, a really big mission for us at Arcadia is to, for it to matter that we did this thing, right? For us to impact not just the science that happens here, but the science, what is possible outside our walls, right? And so we think of that in a number of different ways. Yes, one of those ways is to make our science open, but sometimes the best way to get something out into the world is to commercialize it, right? So all of us know, like I can put a protocol out there, right? And then people can try to replicate it and things like that. But it's really kind of nice when you can buy an off-the-shelf kit to get something to work when it's really, really difficult to work and it's really standardized and someone has put in the work to do the QC and all of that, right? It's actually much, much better for more people to do that, right? So we think of this in a very, very broad sense. It's how can we make the biggest impact and what science other people can do, right? And so I think this is, having that broad lens and not just looking at it so as if these are like sort of antagonistic, goals is really, really helpful.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So many great questions. You've made so many great points. It's great. There's been a couple questions about kind of our open science mission and publishing. So maybe Prachee, you can walk us through kind of what publishing looks like outside of academic journals. Like what are we doing?
Yeah. So some of you may already have some experience of publishing outside of academic journals in the form of preprints, right? So basically anything where authors, we live in the age of the internet where you can put whatever you want online if you want, right? Like we don't really depend on publishers to do that part anymore. They do other sorts of roles, right? Like they organize peer review, they do quality control. A lot of these things are outsourced, as you know, to other scientists, right? They're not necessarily things that are done in-house, right? And so when we think about all of the pieces and what do we actually need to happen, right? There are a couple of principles that we know that we want to do things like get them out into the open, because again, a recognition that all the, good ideas don't live in one place. And we all know that if you really truly believe that science is collaborative and that other people's eyes and contributions have, a huge impact on how good the science can be and how much it can advance and what it can, what can be built upon it, right? So really you don't know where all those good ideas live. And so the only sensible thing is to make it open, right? So that's step one, is to make sure that it's available. And the thing that we always say is just because it's open doesn't mean it's useful, right? Like I can put something in an Excel spreadsheet in a supplemental figure of a preprint and it's open, but it's not useful, right? Like you often don't have the, ability to use those data sets. They often sometimes are missing the metadata. You don't really know exactly, what is, how other people can use it or connect it to the other pieces of information that they need, right? And so that is another goal of Arcadia, is to try to make sure that we're depositing our, data in data repositories, depositing our protocols in protocol repositories, putting that contextual information. We know that that's important, of course. Like sometimes it's not just like modular pieces, having things together in a unit where you can have multiple pieces of data, synthesized into a product that can, give you some sort of idea of a model or something that can be orthogonally tested. That's useful too. And we're going to put all of those things on our website. And hopefully very soon here, in the matter of, weeks, we hope to be able to show you what our initial research products are and the range of those, right? And we want them to be across the range of the research cycle, from ideation to those, useful methods to, synthesis products and just basically, you don't want to wait until like years and years to like have what you think is finished. Science is never finished, right? So we want to make sure that if our science is really, most useful and actually, so we can have more people use it and build upon it, right? We want to make those things open early so that people can actually interact with it and give us public feedback. So I'm happy to talk more about sort of how we think about peer review, but we think it needs to be public and open and making sure that it's not just us as the authors who benefit from making our science better with that feedback, but that the readers also, because we're not relying on these, journal stamps of approval from 2 or 3 secret people. We actually want a broader range of comments from the public from anywhere, right? And not gatekeeping who those people are, right? Because we should not be just deciding a narrow range of people who are able to contribute and make that better. So we want to make that public. And so really, to summarize, it's going to be a broad range of products from throughout the research cycle, posted openly on our website, and the substance of that, the full data sets put in repositories where they ought to live.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One kind of follow-up to this from Shweta, she asked, when Arcadia collaborates with academics, what will the quid pro quo look like for the collaborators, since we don't publish in peer-reviewed journals? So they're not going to get to publish this research that they've done in a journal. What would they get from collaborating with Arcadia?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that because I actually think that this is really good, gets to the crux of a previous question that was asked, which is like, how do we decide on what science we do here? And it's the point I want to make is that we are not trying to do what anybody else can do, right? Like if it can be done in another framework, in another system, like go ahead and do it, right? We want to actually change what is possible to be done, right? Like generate the kind of data sets that will be useful for other people, right? Like I truly believe that if we say like, we're going to generate those data sets or those genomes or whatever, or the tools that can completely change what other people are able to do, I think that will have a dramatic impact. So basically what we're saying is we want to take, find out where we can make the biggest difference in what others are able to do, and then make that available. And so I think of our collaboration very much as an open collaboration, not in the traditional sense where we basically say, hey, let's do some secret project together. And then someone holds on to it and like publish it as in some secret way or after some long period of time. We're just saying like, if we are going to put resources and money and energy into a thing where that we are uniquely able to do, because we don't have a temporary workforce and we don't have a temporary funding, like we can put some sustained effort and resources towards things that can solve things for people that for good reasons they're not able to solve in their current situations. And so I think that is a huge, I think that those are a really big piece of how we choose what we want to do, is what kind of impact it will have. And I think it will be so obvious that there is a huge benefit to those who will use that data, that we'll just make it publicly available, and then they can do with it what they want, right? Like once it's out there, it's in the public domain. And so I think of the collaboration very much as an open collaboration.
Yeah. I think the fact that we're working with non-model systems where people don't have tools, they don't have community, they don't have like a lot of options. That doesn't sound right. A lot of options. It makes it sound like they have to come to us, but it's more like it's a way to like get those things to like supercharge their science and really like open things up. So I think the non-model aspect to it is actually pretty key. Seemay, did you want to answer this question from Benjamin Adler? I can read it out loud. Can you speak a little bit?
Can you read it out loud? Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to the integration between model systems? Theoretically, this is an asset in Arcadia, as I understand it, and academia, yet in more established academia, you see the establishment of the proverbial fiefdoms and territory. What is your philosophy to prevent that?
Gosh, I have so many thoughts on this. Okay. The beginning of the end for me in academia was when I got close to tenure and I had my R01s and all my grants, and someone said to me, now you can be the queen of ticks. And I thought, no, this is such a misunderstanding of who I am and what kind of scientist I am. Like the thing that I have loved most about breaking into ticks is that part, is breaking into it, tooling, like building up a system, exploring the things that are really cool. Like I am actually not a person who enjoys territorialism around this. Like I want to jump around to different things. And I think there's some of this attitude at Arcadia, both philosophically, where like, I don't think it serves anyone to be territorial in science. That is a lie that we tell ourselves for security, but actually the scientific goal of Arcadia is not for us to now anoint and own territory for like 5 new organisms, right? And we've really struggled with like making sure we communicate this. Our goal is to think about how we can reduce the friction and pave the way for other people, including us though, to like quickly cycle between different organisms to like answer the biological question or do whatever they're trying to do, right? And I think that like with the technologies we have in hand these days and all the people doing science right now, like we have the opportunity to think about how to reimagine this process and allow people to essentially, and I mean this in the best possible way, think about how we make organisms more disposable for the science. In the sense, not that I want to not treat them well and with respect, but just like, how can we move more quickly across this evolutionary landscape, right? And I don't want to own an organism. I don't want Arcadia to own an organism. I would like us to build the tools for like more people to do this quickly. And so this is again, like the unique competitive edge we have. Like, I'm not trying to like do the same kind of science that is done elsewhere. There's a lot of great science happening in academia and it's done in a certain way. It's built for like depth. We are like built to like increase the breadth of organisms. And so that's how we think about it.
Yeah. So kind of a follow-up to these, we have 2 questions that are pretty related from Kaylee and Albert. So one asks, is Arcadia working to collect environmental samples to build new databases of microbes? And then Albert asks, are we an entity primarily identifying, cataloging, characterizing new organisms for synthetic biology or engineering them? So maybe we could talk about a little bit more on this, like the scientific mission.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a great question because it really helps us, we have thought about this too, but how would we actually, go about selecting the right organisms to answer the right question, right? Like this is the central tenet of what we are trying to do here, because saying we want to leverage biology, the ways in which it solved different problems, but how do we even identify what are those right organisms, right? And so even in trying to do that, we've come up with our own barriers for us being able to do that, right? Like having, what is the way in which we pursue that? We try to think about, what genomes are available so we know what genes different organisms have, and then looking at their phenotypes and like trying to find wherever that lives, trying to figure out if we can connect these two up. It's extremely low throughput process, right? And thinking about, what is that information that we need but that anybody else would need, right? In order to decide the answer to this question. And what we've discovered is that there's a lot of data out there, but they're very siloed. Some of them are not really usable or reusable or discoverable, and they're not really connected, right? So there are all these different data sets where you have genotypes, where you have different omics data sets, where you have different phenotypes, but it's all sort of distributed and not connected. It's not really easy to mine that, right? It makes it a very difficult process. So there are a lot of things that we can do, right? Where we think, okay, what can Arcadia do to try and solve this problem so that we can answer this question and everybody else can answer this question about what's the right organism to use, right? And so what we want to do is to think about those infrastructural challenges, but also think about how can we contribute to generating the kind of data sets that we would need in order to sort of do this type of characterization so other people can find it. Now, to answer one of the questions, which is, are we going to go after environmental samples, right? So now if you go at environmental samples, there's a huge range of challenges that you have, right? Like obviously you need to be able to isolate an organism. You need to be able to cultivate an organism. You need to be able to have genetics and make genetic tractability. And again, there are all of these different things, right? So part of this is thinking like, if we actually want to look at a broad range of organisms, where is the right place to start, right? And there's a huge number of organisms that have already been isolated and cultivated, and yet there's not any genotype or phenotype information about it, right? Or any omics information, right? So there's just, where we can easily even, in different culture collections where they already exist, can actually, characterize some of these better and make the data available, right? Such that we and others can do that, right? Where we can actually mine that information and like come up with the answers to those problems, right? And so it's not to say that we wouldn't, in the future try to say like, oh, this seems like a really outstanding organism. We need to find a way to isolate and cultivate it and all of these things, right? It is going after, again, trying to say, rather than accepting the barriers that prevent us from doing those things, can we make some of those things tractable? What range of organisms can we make tractable in this sort of bulk way, right? Sometimes it's a really individual solution, like genetic tractability it's not the same across organisms. It's a different delivery problem. But really thinking about, how can we make this broad range, possible, and think about what can our contribution be in a way that will impact the most people, right? So I will say that as far as like cultivating, like having like libraries of organisms, it's something I've been actually avoiding trying to do, because one of the main things is we want those things need to be extremely stable, extremely, reliable, archivable, making sure that all of those things are available. Again, with the mind of let's make sure that we have the broadest impact, and it needs to have some longevity, right? And the truth is we are doing a bold experiment on science. And so to me, I think what we really should do is make our data and our data infrastructure have some longevity and really expand what information other people have at their disposal, right? So that is sort of first on the list.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Information, not organisms. I think that's great. Let's get into, there's some questions about like hiring and like kind of internal culture type things. So I just lost the question. So what what would success look like for a person or a project at Arcadia? Seemay, do you want to talk about like how we measure or how we think? We're still starting. How we think about like what we consider successful, or how we know we're moving towards outcome.
Those are two very different things, people and projects. So how about Prachee, you take projects, I'll take people. Okay, so to get philosophical here, like just a quick thought on like metrics, because I really don't want us to get lost in like metrics here. Metrics is hard because when you're trying to do something different, and I know I can only say this for so long, it could easily become like a lazy thing later. But it's hard to rely on existing metrics when you're trying to build something different. That is the fast track towards the means, like regression to the means right away. Because what you measure will dictate what you do. And so far, what we measure is based on what we do, and we're trying to do something different. So how do you think about metrics then when you're trying to build something new before you even know what you should be measuring? So I've been thinking a lot about like input metrics rather than output metrics. And like, what do we as scientists know are the right ingredients for our success? I mean, I think we know for some of the big science that we're doing at Arcadia is that it takes more than one person. It has to be a team-based effort. So are we setting people up in a way, and are people doing their science in a way that like they're doing bigger team science? Are they thinking beyond the product being a publication? They're thinking beyond that towards like, what's after that? Like, how does it become useful in the world? And like someone who can like think about both of these things differently is good. And then I think the other thing that I think about as an ingredient for like a successful scientist at Arcadia is like, how self-reflective are they? How aware are they of how these structures overlaid can influence the kind of science they do? And how willing are they to like disrupts that, right? Like, and this is why like it's not easy being at Arcadia right now, because we've talked about all these things we want to change, but we have to remember that it's people involved. Scientists are people. And so there's quite a bit of like sociology and psychology happening here of like, okay, we could publish things in bioRxiv, but then we have to think about the human element. Like, are we all going to like rely on the thing that we're used to and not actually innovate on like new ways to publish and share information? You know, like everything we do, like part of that success is that every single individual at Arcadia is fully bought into them being meta scientists with us. So I would say very generally, those are some things that I look for. And, you know, like, I think there's a final kind of like fuzzy feeling thing, which is that I think most scientists care a lot about their science, and it is a big part of their life satisfaction. And so asking yourself, like, do I feel like I'm getting maximized as a scientist? Am I happy about the science that I do? I know there's limits to that, but like, I'm paying a lot of attention to that as a measure of input success, right? Like, how are our scientists doing? Do they feel challenged in the right ways? And I would say right now, like, it seems like our scientists are having the time of their lives. Like, that is a great input metric. Sorry for the F-bomb.
That's okay. We're being very real here today. Yeah, that's a great answer. Prachee, project, successful project.
Yeah. And so these are actually very interrelated too. So, you know, again, if we think about Arcadia's mission more broadly as in, you know, what we do here impact what happens not here, right? And so, you know, that is the sort of like central tenet and like the lens with which I view this, you know, our progress and our success, right? And again, we don't have the typical metrics to rely on, right? So what happens when people typically start something new, right? They say, oh, we're going to publish some papers in some flashy journals, and then everyone will know we're doing good science, right? I actually think that we have a much, much higher bar here at Arcadia, because we can't rely on some stamp that says, okay, a couple of people who we've decided who those people are, like a couple of gatekeepers have given a stamp of approval. And, you know, I personally don't think that 2 or 3, you know, people can actually cover the broad range of disciplinary science that exists in a article, right? And so we're really, I think that's actually not a very high bar to say, oh, we need to signal that there's like, it's good science in order for it to be good science. But that's actually not really the bar for us. For us, without being able to rely on those things, we actually have to do science that matters to other people, right? We have to do science that gets reused, right? And in order to do science that gets reused, we have to put it out in a way that is conducive to reuse, right? And so really for me, I'm thinking about how do we continue to push out the science into the world that is reusable by other people, that people are like coming to and engaging with us on, right? Because I do think that, you know, people will say, well, how do you know if you're not in this existing, you know, science diet of the rest of, you know, academic scientists and other scientists, this is the place where everyone looks, you know, how will anybody pay attention? And that is a true fear, right? So we want to make our products discoverable, citable, all of these things, but I honestly think if we generate new resources and new data sets and new tools that can completely transform what other people do, they are going to use it, right? It's not like if you're working on something and a genome appears, you're not going to go and like try and like utilize that genome and then come and tell us what was frustrating for you about it, right? So it's just like what we really depend on is making sure that the things that we're pursuing are going to have an impact, are going to be maximally reusable. Try to engage the community and find out what can we do like to make that science better. We are not afraid of being wrong. I can't say it enough, that we just want to make the science better. So we really, really deeply want to engage everyone in science that wants to use what we produce, right? And have them tell us how much better it can be, what their roadblocks are, what they used it to build upon, what they built upon that information. And those, to me, those different ways in which we look at, the impact of our science and what comes out of it, right? That is something that is really central to thinking about the success of our science, which I think, again, is a higher bar than what we typically do.
Yeah. I agree. Yes. Okay, so going back to the idea, going back to kind of people and like Arcadia as an experiment, and Arcadia is like a bold experiment. How are we thinking about building Arcadia to be an inclusive environment from the ground up and not suffer from some of the issues that invade other STEM and academic spaces?
This is a big question with a very long answer. Prachee, maybe you and I can go back and forth on this a little bit. I think it has to be part of like the DNA of the organization. One way that I'm like thinking about this is like, I really do not want like thinking about inclusion and diversity as like a separate department or effort within Arcadia. Like it needs to pervade every aspect of Arcadia, number one. So we are thinking about it a lot. We have tons of room for improvement still, and it's been a really humbling process to learn how to do this correctly. But that's like one short answer I can give is like, we're definitely thinking about this in everything we do. The other is like, we just have like really clear culture of like zero tolerance for some of the behaviors that we think of as toxic. And it goes beyond what is like super obvious. There's like, we are extremely conscientious about internal culture around this. Recruiting is like, a really big challenge for us. Prachee, maybe you want to comment on some of that?
Yeah. And actually one thing I was going to say is that, when, it is actually totally in keeping with our idea that, we really think that if you want to do the best science, right, like you have to look at the diversity of organisms. Well, I think if you want to do this best science, you have to look at the diversity of scientists, right? Like if you truly believe that all good science doesn't live in one place, and I will just tackle, right, even though no one asked it, like, yes, we are yet another thing that lives in the Bay Area. And I promise you that like both Seemay and I would have put it somewhere else, right? Like there are just a handful of constraints that keep us from being somewhere else in this moment, but we really do have aspirations that what we do here, this experiment is maximally replicable, and there can be sort of 10 more Arcadias everywhere, right? Like wherever people are, wherever science is done. And especially when you think about this kind of science that we're trying to do here, taking organisms from their environment. This can happen anywhere, especially different, a broad range of environments. These people study this all over the place. And especially since it's not well resourced, these are things where people have really fought against the grain to try and make science, advance despite their constraints, right? Despite really this uphill battle of using their sort of limited funding and limited, all of the different challenges that exist in these sort of organismal communities. People have been pushing everywhere science is done. People have been pushing, trying to learn from the universe, right? Like learning from nature what all of the science gets done. And that means that there are people with tremendous and extraordinary experience in trying to do what we are trying to do here, right? So I just want to highlight the fact too, that this is not like a thing we invented from nothing, right? Like this, we sit on the shoulders of scientists everywhere forever who have been doing this. And really to us, I think we truly just believe that this science happens, it happens everywhere. So we really are aggressively trying to pursue and go after, making sure everyone understands like this is for them, right? Like this is not something that we are trying to be gatekeepers on what, who gets to do this. Like it is being done everywhere. And we need to to find and empower people that are, that have put so much of their, scientific lifeblood into something that we think is so important, right? And so I think it starts with the true belief and recognition of that fact, and then making sure that, because again, and it's same with our open science mission, we truly believe that all those good ideas live everywhere and among everyone. And so we just have to, continue to make sure that we are putting out, what are our sort of scientific and cultural missions and values, and saying these are the things that we care about. And we know that people everywhere are really aligned with this, and we think that we can unearth them. So I really encourage, to everyone who is here, everyone who is, everyone has their sort of networks and everything, is to really think about, this idea. Like, I think it's hard to actually convey that this is for everybody, right? And it's not supposed to be this, elitist exclusive thing where we're using those traditional metrics. Often we are actually more biased towards like, what have people done? What have people, contributed, even considering their constraints, like what have they contributed in a way that aligns with our very community focused mission and our broad scientific mission.
Okay, so this was a question from the Q&A box, which I just found. So Arcadia is an experiment. What happens if this experiment fails? Like, what are some of the failure modes of Arcadia? And, what do we think about, like, what will happen to Arcadians if Arcadia fails? So maybe we'll start with just failure modes. Seemay, you want to lead off on that?
Oh, let's do this together, Prachee. I mean, I think one of the biggest failure modes for me is that this isn't different. Mm-hmm. That we will look different for maybe year one and then slowly regress to the means. That's my biggest fear. Prachee, what's your biggest fear?
That was exactly my biggest fear. No, because it is so genuine. This is what I tell everyone, is that, it's really easy to say, hey, we're going to do something different. Right. And it's like really cute and fun and nice. And everyone's like, oh, good for you. You're going to do something. You're going to do something different. And that's easy enough to do when you have a strong opinion about stuff, right? Seemay and I, as you can tell, have very strong opinions about lots of things, right? And so when you have that about things that we think that we can fix, it's easy to sort of like innovate in that direction, push towards trying to make that thing happen. It's something we've been pushing for in our lives up until this point, right? Like, how do we try to think about making those things different? The problem comes when you come up against a challenge you don't know how to solve. And there's an infinite number of those, right? So there's like an infinite number of problems we don't know how to solve because we are just learning how to think about doing this, right? And so when you come up against those, it is extremely common and human nature to say, I don't know how to solve this problem, but let me use my wealth of experience in other contexts to try and apply it to this problem, right? And yet those contexts, as Seemay has pointed out multiple times, are different. They're different in really key ways, right? And so that requires us for everything to rethink. Like, we don't want to, of course, like reinvent the wheel. We can't innovate on every direction, but it does force us to really question, okay, we don't know how to solve this problem. And is the thing that we're going to do, when we don't know how to solve this problem, does it open us up to regressing towards the mean? Is it going to be the slippery slope that takes us right back into the exact thing that we're trying to avoid, right? So we have to do that, like, really hard look at all of those things over and over and over and over again, right? And so that is the true tremendous challenge of this organization, is thinking about that. And because, we exist in order to run this experiment on how we do science. And that's why I think that this is the biggest failure mode, right? Because any one of these things can be like, failures can be informative. This is something we actually fundamentally understand here, right? The important thing is that we make sure that what we do, we document it, we make it available to other people so that anybody else who is looking at this experiment, right? We can say, first of all, we're doing something that is different so that you can see what that might look like, right? To change people's conceptions of what is possible, right? To change that Overton window, right? To shift it over. And then to say, okay, well, maybe some piece of it didn't work, or maybe some piece of it, kind of worked, and other people can think about taking that and iterating on it in their own context, right? So for us, like the real contribution also is to make sure that we make that available. So I guess what I would say, if I was going to say something different, that a way in which we could fail is to be too siloed and secretive about what we're doing here and how we're doing it, right? Because I think some of the biggest benefits of what we are doing is making it available so that other people can learn from our successes and our failures.
Yeah.
The bit about scientists, though, that I think is actually important for me to comment on, I get asked this a lot. how do you take these risks and protect the scientists who want to stay in academia? The answer is we don't. The answer is that like we have to hire and recruit people right now with whom this is not a risk, for whom they are not trying to hedge and try and go back to academia. I'm not even judging that thing, right? I think I actually am very supportive of a lot of stuff that happens in academia. But the point is that like we can't protect people. And so we have to be as transparent as possible and say, we need to hire people right now who can absorb this risk with us because they are aligned with us on exactly all the things Prachee said as their biggest failure modes as individuals too. So this is not an easy thing. Like we have, there's a lot of amazing scientists that we haven't moved forward together with, right? Because like we need people right now who can do this with us and for whom this doesn't feel scary. And that takes a very particular person to do that right now. And that's our safety net, is to like arm ourselves with a whole organization of people that are crazy like us.
Yep. Weirdo science enthusiasts, I believe, is the title that we have adopted. Absolutely. Okay. So we only have 3 minutes left. We could take another question, or I just want to give you guys an opportunity to kind of like anything that we haven't touched on that like you want to like follow up on, or a question that you saw in the chat. I want to give you guys some space.
Yeah, I'll just comment real briefly that I really want to thank everyone who came here today to learn about what we're doing. And I realize that, it's not everything that you've heard today is not something that's like, transparently available. We're still like working on getting things up and running here. And I will say that, this thing that Seemay said about being, finding people who are, game for this kind of, awesome challenge, that see this not as something that they want to like leap to something that they see as like ultimately safe, right? Like, especially from an academic job, like we came from like forever jobs, right? And really this is an opportunity, right? This is, I think, something that pulled Seemay and I here is that this is an opportunity, right? In order to shape what this thing becomes, right? And so to really, I'm also very transparent with people that being adaptable is really, really important here at Arcadia, and something that, Seemay and I have in spades, and so does everyone else who's here. And it's because we are all just trying to be better, right? Like we are trying to learn and be better and do the best version of this experiment that we know how to do. And that's going to mean we're going to be wrong a lot. And I hope that people feel, whether they're here or in their own environment, I hope that they feel empowered to make mistakes and do the best version of whatever they are doing, right? And I think that is space that we all have, and it's a choice that we all have, right? Like we can feel very constrained by our systems, but I really do hope that everyone, everywhere, whatever your situation, whatever your circumstance, whatever your particular, whatever sector you work in, that you still feel similarly empowered to do, your best version of that experiment for you.
I guess I would end on a note of just like maybe a call to action that like, because what we're so interested in is like learning, making mistakes, documenting that. It would be really great to have more people out there who are documenting this externally, that like, I think for meta science to be a true discipline, there's so many other organizations doing experiments right now. I would really welcome people who are interested in this to get out there and sort of study it and document it for us, because like we have a super biased view. It wouldn't be a good experiment if it's only us documenting us. Like we will tell you the version that we want to tell you. And so please, like if there are people out there who want to like actually grab this moment and help learn on a meta level, there's so many things going on right now beyond just Arcadia. I would love to like engage more people on this particular topic. So.
Perfect note to end on. Get involved. All right.